The line inside the county records office was already beginning to curl near the front door, a low, disgruntled murmur spreading as people shifted from foot to foot, scrolling their phones, or glancing at the fluorescent-lit ceiling, as if hoping it would deliver some small mercy of speed. Into this tense, bureaucratic quiet stepped Frank Delaney, 78 years old, silver-stubbled, a faded ball cap pulled low, and a windbreaker zipped tight over an old button-down shirt. He walked with a limp you might miss if you weren't looking for it, but no one in line was looking for anything except a way out. In his hands, he clutched a folder so old and crumpled, it looked like a relic. A faded label, "Dept of the Navy Land Recompense Authorization," peeked from beneath a rubber band, the kind you only see on things saved for far too long. Frank's shoes made soft, uneven squeaks against the linoleum as he approached the counter. The clerk behind it, a young woman named Olivia, hair pulled in a sharp ponytail, navy blazer pressed to perfection, looked up, her eyes cool and practiced. Frank cleared his throat. "Excuse me, miss, I have—" She cut him off with a forced, polite smile, the kind you use for the very old or the very slow. "Yes, sir? I'll need your request form and any valid ID." Her gaze fell to the battered folder, and she blinked. "What's that?" Frank opened the folder, careful, almost reverent, like he was handling something breakable. Inside were several documents, some so faded you'd have to squint, others with blue ink signatures curling across the paper. "I'm here about the land claim, ma'am. Navy Recompense Program from '72. I've got all the authorizations, originals, see?" He laid them out, one by one, his hands trembling just a little. Some folks in line craned their necks, curious. Most simply looked away, hoping whatever was happening wouldn't slow things down. Olivia picked up the top sheet and studied it. Her lips pursed. The official Navy seal had yellowed. The ink from half a century ago had begun to fade. Her eyes flicked up, and there it was. The smirk. "Sir, this looks like it came out of a cereal box." She didn't even try to keep her voice down. "We can't just give land to anyone who walks in, claiming they were in the military. You have to understand. People try this sort of thing all the time." A ripple of laughter from somewhere in the line. Someone coughed. Frank's cheeks burned, but he held his ground, tapping one finger to the paperwork. "Ma'am, with respect, that's not just some story. My CO filed that claim. This here is the authorization. I served on the USS Bluefin. There was an explosion. Fire. She cut him off again, this time louder. "I'm going to need you to wait over there, sir. We'll have to call in security for this. There are procedures." Frank's mouth worked, the words catching. "Security? Miss, But Olivia had already pressed a button beneath the desk. Moments later, 2 courthouse security officers appeared, looming and brisk, faces set in that mask of authority reserved for troublemakers and vagrants. "Is there a problem, Olivia?" asked the taller guard, glancing at the paperwork as if it might bite. She didn't look at Frank as she spoke. "This gentleman claims he's entitled to land because of some Navy program. There's no way to verify this. I'm not going to have my name on the paperwork for a scam." She shot a pointed glance at the line, ensuring her voice carried. "Sir, people like you fake stuff like this all the time." There it was, the phrase that stung worse than the condescension, worse than the laughter. The implication was clear. In the long pause that followed, Frank could feel all eyes on him, the humiliating warmth spreading from his ears to his chest. He glanced at his hands, rough, scarred, still shaking, but not from age. "Please," he managed, the word barely more than a rasp. "You don't understand. I waited years for this. My paperwork's all in order. I never wanted—" But the guards had moved in. One took his elbow, not roughly, but firmly enough. "Let's go, sir. We can figure this out somewhere else." The other muttered, just loud enough for Frank and anyone nearby to hear. "Should have cleaned up before coming to a courthouse." Frank bit back a retort. For a moment, as he stumbled slightly, an old memory flickered. Thick smoke, heat, alarms blaring, someone screaming for help. He closed his eyes just for a second and muttered under his breath, the bitterness clear. 50 years ago, I dragged men out of fire. Now I'm dragged out of a lobby. A few people in the line tittered. Others looked away, embarrassed. Olivia watched impassively, arms crossed. The courthouse felt suddenly cold. As the guards began to lead Frank toward the exit, a sharp, authoritative voice rang out from across the lobby. A voice used to being obeyed, used to command. "Wait, what did you say his name was?" Everything stopped. Even Olivia blinked, startled by the interruption. One of the guards replied, "Delaney, Frank Delaney." A man in a judge's robe strode toward the group, mid-60s, with gray hair and a presence that seemed to quiet the room. Judge Whitaker glanced at the folder, then at Frank, and back at the guards. His expression was unreadable for a moment, then suddenly fierce. "Unhand that man, immediately." The entire room seemed to freeze in place, a collective breath drawn and held. Frank, still in the grip of the guards, looked up in disbelief. Olivia's mouth fell open. Even the people in line, impatient just seconds ago, now watched in stunned silence, phones raised, fingers pausing mid-scroll. The scene, once a small private humiliation, had just turned into something much bigger, something nobody in that courthouse would soon forget. For a moment, time itself felt suspended in the fluorescent-lit courthouse. Judge Whitaker's words hung in the air, heavy and commanding, breaking through the routine buzz like a hammer through glass. The guards who'd been holding Frank paused, uncertainty flickering across their faces. Olivia, still behind her desk, looked genuinely confused now, the self-assurance draining from her eyes as she struggled to process what was happening. Judge Whitaker moved closer, his steps purposeful, each stride exuding authority earned from decades on the bench. He didn't bother to address the guards first. Instead, his sharp gaze locked onto Olivia. "Miss, did I hear correctly? Frank Delaney?" His tone brooked no contradiction. Olivia swallowed, her cheeks reddening beneath the judge's scrutiny. She fumbled with the folder in her hands, suddenly aware of how thin it felt, how heavy the moment had become. "Yes, Your Honor. This man, he was causing a disturbance. I couldn't verify." The judge's hand shot up, silencing her mid-sentence. "Enough." He turned to Frank, looking him over carefully. The lined face, the calloused hands, the battered dignity. "Mr. Delaney, is that correct?" Frank managed a nod. His voice was quieter than before, but steady. "Yes, sir. That's my name." The judge's eyes softened for just a flicker, but then he turned back to the guards. "Take your hands off him right now. He is not to be treated like a criminal in this courthouse." With some visible discomfort, the guards released Frank's arms. One muttered an apology, barely audible, while the other retreated a step. The air in the lobby seemed to shift. A few people in line started whispering, some recording on their phones, sensing that this was no ordinary day at the county office. Olivia tried to regroup, clutching Frank's folder to her chest. "Your Honor, with all due respect, the paperwork isn't standard. There's no digital record of this claim. We have protocols for a reason." Judge Whitaker regarded her coldly. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" He took the folder from her, flipping through the pages. As he did, Frank's heart hammered in his chest, not out of fear, but out of a strange mixture of hope and dread. He had faced worse than humiliation in his lifetime, but this was a new kind of trial. Whitaker's hands shook just slightly as he studied the topmost document. He turned a page, then another, each yellowed sheet sparking a memory. For a moment, the judge's jaw clenched and his eyes grew distant, as if he were looking through the paper and seeing something much further away. "Mr. Delaney," the judge said softly, "you served on the USS Bluefin, didn't you?" Frank blinked, surprised at the judge's knowledge. "Yes, Your Honor, I did. Stationed from 69 to 72. I was there when—" His voice broke off, the rest of the memory too heavy to speak aloud in front of strangers. A hush fell. The judge turned toward the gathered crowd, voice rising enough for everyone to hear. "There was a fire, an internal explosion. I've heard about it my whole life." He looked directly at Frank, his eyes intense. "You saved 4 men that day, didn't you?" Frank shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at his hands. "Just did what had to be done, sir. Didn't think anyone kept track of that sort of thing." But Whitaker pressed on, his voice thick with emotion. "My father was one of them. He served under Captain Nolan. He was the 4th man you carried out. He always told me about the sailor who pulled him out of the smoke. Never knew your name, only that you saved his life." Frank met the judge's gaze, his own eyes suddenly wet. "I never knew their names either, just that I couldn't leave anyone behind." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. In that moment, everything changed. The hum of the courthouse, the petty frustrations of bureaucracy, all faded into the background. There was only the recognition, long overdue, between 2 men joined by a 50-year-old act of heroism. Judge Whitaker straightened, his voice breaking just a little as he spoke. "Unhand that man, immediately, and give him back his folder." He turned to Olivia, who was frozen with shock. "Miss, step aside. I'll handle this personally." Reluctantly, Olivia handed over the documents. She tried to regain her composure, but the confident clerk from minutes before was gone. The crowd watched, riveted, phones up, some streaming live, others whispering among themselves. For the first time, Frank's story was being seen by more than just bureaucrats. The judge guided Frank toward the side of the lobby, motioning for the guards to back off completely. "Let's go to my chambers," he said quietly. "You deserve more than this spectacle." As they left the main hall, the tension in the air remained. Olivia stared after them, anxiety and frustration mixing across her face. Some in line clapped, a few cheered, but most just watched in stunned silence, unsure what they had just witnessed. Frank followed the judge through a maze of hallways, each step somehow lighter than before, though his knees still ached and his heart still pounded. As they walked, the judge leaned close, speaking softly. "I can't tell you how long I've waited for this. My father always wanted to thank you in person. He never got the chance." Frank smiled, bittersweet. He lived. That was all I ever hoped for. Inside the judge's chambers, the world quieted. The air was rich with polished wood and old books. Judge Whitaker motioned for Frank to sit, and for the first time all morning, Frank felt his shoulders loosen, the weight of decades shifting. The judge set the battered folder on his desk, looking at it with new respect. Back in the lobby, Olivia tried to regain her professional composure, but whispers rippled through the crowd. Several people searched Frank's name online. A local journalist who'd been waiting for a routine courthouse report began scribbling notes, her instincts tingling. In that courthouse, the story was no longer about paperwork or protocol. It was about something deeper, about dignity, memory, and the invisible threads that connect lives across decades. The world had moved on, but some debts lingered, waiting for the moment when the truth could finally come to light. And as Frank sat across from the judge, his old, battered folder at last treated with the respect it deserved, the courthouse outside hummed with rumors, whispers, and the promise that sometimes, just sometimes, history does not forget. Long after the courthouse chaos faded into background noise and the judge's words stopped echoing in his ears, Frank Delaney found himself back home in the quiet world he'd made for himself. The city was already waking up, streetlights blinking off, sunlight fighting through a bank of low-gray clouds. Frank's modest house stood at the end of a street forgotten by time. Small, single-story, with peeling paint and a battered mailbox still proudly displaying the name Delaney in faded black letters. Inside, everything felt suspended between eras. Old and new collided. A flat-screen TV nobody ever turned on, a stack of unopened mail, and everywhere echoes of the past. Navy hats hung from pegs in the entryway. Dusty model ships lined the living room shelves. The mantelpiece bore a solemn row of medals and ribbons, each resting in velvet-lined boxes. Some visitors might have called it clutter, but to Frank, it was a lifeline. He shrugged off his windbreaker and draped it over a wooden chair, letting out a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside. The world outside could be cruel and noisy, but in here the quiet was his companion. The only sound was the gentle hum of an old radio perched on the kitchen counter. Frank fiddled with its dials until a station came through. Old jazz standards, soft and warbly, a familiar comfort. He set to work fixing the radio, as he'd done 100 times before. The back panel was loose again, and Frank's big, scarred fingers worked the tiny screws with surprising delicacy. The kitchen was scattered with little projects, clock radios, broken watches, a transistor set whose parts seemed determined to disappear. For a man who had saved lives with his bare hands, coaxing life back into old machines was a different kind of challenge, a daily act of patience. "Easy does it," he muttered, steadying a wire. "You always go too fast and then you—" The wire slipped. Frank chuckled to himself, shaking his head. He tried again, this time slower. There was a lesson in it, he knew. Sometimes you had to let things come back to life in their own time. On the windowsill, a stray cat, one eye missing, fur matted from a dozen battles, watched Frank's progress. She'd started coming around last winter, thin and suspicious, but Frank had a soft spot for lost causes. He set out a little saucer of milk each morning, and now the cat regarded him as her own strange breed of roommate. He called her Salty, after the old Navy superstition. He scratched Salty behind the ears, smiling. "You stick with me, old girl. I know what it's like to be ignored." In the living room, an old photograph in a tarnished frame caught the morning light, a black and white shot of a submarine crew, young men packed shoulder to shoulder, their faces shining with the kind of bravado only youth can muster. Frank stood near the center, hands folded behind his back, uniform sharp, a glint of pride in his eyes. Most of those faces were gone now, lost to time or war or simply the steady passage of years. Frank adjusted the frame gently. Sometimes he talked to those ghosts, quiet conversations meant for no one but himself. "You boys wouldn't believe how they treat veterans these days," he'd say. "Whole world's gone digital. Paperwork's all anyone cares about." He'd chuckle at the irony, how a country that once asked for everything now demanded a printout to prove a life had been lived. After a while, he went to his bedroom and opened a battered drawer full of letters, some official, others handwritten in shaky cursive. He sifted through them slowly, as if reliving each moment. There were commendations, notes from fellow sailors, a few yellowed photos of reunions long past. At the very bottom was the speech he'd been practicing for weeks, a statement to the county, words he hoped would carry the weight of his service. Frank unfolded the speech, cleared his throat, and stood in front of the cracked bathroom mirror. The reflection staring back at him was older than the man he remembered, but the eyes were the same, steady, searching. He read aloud, voice trembling at first, then finding its rhythm. My name is Frank Delaney. I served my country with honor. I ask not for thanks, but for fairness. The land claim I make today is not a gift, but a promise kept, a small piece of the future paid for with the past. He paused, listening to his own words bounce off the tile. Salty meowed in the hall, unimpressed by the performance. Frank tried again, this time imagining an audience of his old crewmates. Some debts are never paid in full. Some sacrifices never fade. I don't want parades or medals. I just want to be heard. The speech ended there. He folded the paper back into his pocket, uncertain if he'd ever need it again. Outside, the day was moving on. He opened the door to let Salty out, watching as the cat trotted into the sun, tail high, as if the world owed her something too. Frank lingered on the porch for a while, letting the breeze carry away the morning's embarrassment. He thought of the judge's eyes, the shock on Olivia's face, the strange sensation of being seen after so many years of invisibility. It was a new feeling, both exhilarating and terrifying. The world, it seemed, might finally be listening. He went back inside and poured himself a mug of black coffee, hands still shaking. As he drank, he gazed at the old Navy flag folded on the mantel, its stars and stripes dulled by time but never by memory. He never asked for thanks. He just asked to be heard. The phrase echoed in his mind, something his late wife used to say when the memories got too heavy. She'd been his anchor through the years, the one person who understood that true service often goes unseen. In the silence, Frank allowed himself a rare smile. Whatever happened next, whatever the courthouse, the clerk, or the judge decided, he knew who he was. That was enough. For now, in this small, quiet life, dignity lived not in ceremony or applause, but in the steady rhythm of small kindnesses, quiet courage, and the relentless hope that, even after decades, the truth might finally matter. In the privacy of his chambers, surrounded by shelves lined with case books and war memorabilia, Judge Whitaker motioned Frank Delaney to a leather armchair beside the window. The morning sunlight poured in, illuminating dust motes that swirled above a heavy, dark desk scarred with decades of use. For a moment, the courthouse felt 1,000 miles away, replaced by the hush of a world where old debts and ancient gratitude could finally breathe. Whitaker sat down, removed his robe, and loosened his tie with hands that trembled slightly, betraying the emotion stirring beneath his practiced composure. He studied Frank with the sort of attention rarely shown to strangers, less like a judge assessing a petitioner, and more like a man who'd spent his whole life rehearsing this meeting in his mind. Mr. Delaney, Whitaker began, his voice lower and softer than before, I don't think you realize what you just walked into. He glanced at the battered folder, now treated with a reverence it hadn't known in years, and then at the medals pinned above Frank's heart. Frank nodded, uncertain, but patient. I'm not trying to cause trouble, Your Honor. Just hoping someone might finally listen. Whitaker shook his head. Not trouble, not at all. My name is William Whitaker, but I want you to know me today as just another son who owes you more than words. He took a deep breath, the weight of memory pressing on his shoulders. My father was Lieutenant George Whitaker, stationed on the USS Bluefin from 1969 to 1972. The mention of the submarine pulled Frank back through time, a metallic corridor, the blare of klaxons, thick black smoke rolling through the hatches, the acrid taste of fear. Frank blinked, swallowing the memories, but he couldn't help but glance at the judge with newfound respect. Whitaker pulled an old black-and-white photograph from his desk drawer and set it between them. It showed a group of Navy men in dress whites, their faces fresh and proud, the bluefin looming behind them. His finger tapped the image, settling on a younger version of his father. He told me stories growing up, stories about a fire on board, an explosion in the engine room, about chaos, confusion, and about one man who wouldn't leave anyone behind. Frank let the memories surface. That was a bad day. Fire alarms didn't sound right at first. The smoke was so thick, most of us couldn't see past our own hands. Someone was yelling for help. We were all just kids trying to stay alive. His voice trailed off, emotion clogging his throat. Judge Whitaker nodded, empathy raw in his eyes. My father never forgot what happened. He said he'd given up hope. He thought the next breath would be his last, until a pair of strong arms grabbed him and dragged him through the smoke. He never knew your name, but he called you the stubborn one who swore at the flames. A ghost of a smile touched Frank's lips. I probably did. I figured if I was going out, I'd give that fire a piece of my mind. The humor faded, replaced by the heaviness of old wounds. I just remember grabbing hold and not letting go. It's all muscle memory in a crisis. Whitaker's hand lingered on the photo. My father always regretted not finding you, not saying thank you. He didn't make it long after the Navy, lung damage from that day. But he talked about you every year on his birthday, called you his guardian angel. He told me, if you ever meet the man who saved my life, you listen to him. You honor him. Frank looked away, fighting a surge of emotion he hadn't expected. I didn't know any names, just saw uniforms. All I wanted was to make sure no mother ever got that telegram, the one that says her son isn't coming home. There was a long pause. The two men sat in the sunlit quiet, connected by the weight of the past and the shared understanding of sacrifice. The judge's voice, when it came, was soft and reverent. You carried 4 men out that day. My father was the 4th. You never asked for anything in return. But here you are, 50 years later, standing in a county office, treated like a nuisance. Frank shook his head. I didn't do it for recognition. Didn't do it for any of this. Just couldn't leave a man behind. I thought that's what service meant. Whitaker's eyes glistened. You don't know how long I've waited to meet you. The moment stretched, delicate and raw. In the silence, the boundaries between judge and veteran, authority and petitioner, simply dissolved. Whitaker reached across the desk and clasped Frank's hand in both of his, holding tight. A silent thanks, decades overdue. From the hallway came the muffled sound of voices, clerks and guards, the courthouse machinery grinding on, oblivious to what was being mended behind closed doors. Whitaker leaned back and wiped at his eyes. You know, in all my years on the bench, I've rarely seen justice done the way it ought to be. But today's different. Frank finally found his voice. It was just another day back then, just another fire. But I've carried those faces with me ever since. Some nights, I still hear the alarms. I see the smoke. I wonder if I did enough. You did, Whitaker said simply. You saved my father's life, and you saved a son's future. Frank tried to smile, but the pain and pride were too closely intertwined. Didn't think anyone remembered. Feels strange after all these years. Whitaker stood, straightening his jacket. We remember. Maybe not as loudly as we should. But we do. He stepped over to a bookshelf and retrieved a small, carefully preserved box. He opened it to reveal a service medal identical to the one Frank had earned. My father left this for me. Said it was never about the medal. It was about the man who earned it. I want you to know, Mr. Delaney, that you are seen. You are heard. And if it's the last thing I do, I'll make sure your story gets the respect it deserves. Frank stared at the medal, then at the judge, a wave of emotion threatening to pull him under. He simply nodded, his words lost, but his gratitude shining clear in his eyes. The sunlight in the chamber seemed a little brighter, the air a little lighter, as if the world had paused to let two men finally speak their truths, and for the first time in a long time, Frank Delaney felt something like hope. News traveled fast in small courthouses. Even as Judge Whitaker and Frank Delaney spoke in the private calm of the judge's chamber, the tension that had exploded at the records office counter continued to ripple outward, pulling more and more eyes into the story. Olivia, now stripped of her previous certainty, sat at her desk with her back ramrod straight, her carefully composed face betraying the storm beneath. She ran a nervous finger over Frank's folder, now handed back to the judge, wishing the morning could be rewritten with a single, different word. It wasn't long before the courthouse's open lobby buzzed with the static of office rumors. Staff clustered in corners, their low voices threading the names Delaney and Whitaker into every conversation. The guards who had escorted Frank just minutes earlier exchanged uneasy glances, already unsure who exactly had been in the wrong. The electronic chime of the main doors startled Olivia. In strode Cynthia Barton, the county supervisor, a woman famous for her unyielding schedule and relentless pursuit of order. She was trailed by a pair of deputies and a court administrator who looked as if he'd much rather be anywhere else. Cynthia's heels clicked across the tiles with an authority that even Judge Whitaker rarely matched. The assembled staff parted around her like water. "Miss Olivia," Cynthia said, voice crisp as winter air, "a word, now." Olivia straightened. "Yes, ma'am." She tried to keep her voice steady, but her nerves betrayed her. She explained the events of the morning, her doubts about the legitimacy of Frank's documents, her concern about protocol, and finally, the judge's intervention. Cynthia listened with folded arms, her face impassive. When Olivia finished, Cynthia took a slow breath. "You called security on a decorated veteran, embarrassed him in public, and did this in front of a lobby full of people." Her gaze was ice. "Do you have any idea who Mr. Delaney is?" Olivia's voice was barely a whisper. I didn't. The paperwork wasn't standard, and you could have asked for help." Cynthia's tone softened, but only slightly. Instead, "You made it a spectacle." Before Olivia could answer, the judge's office door swung open. Judge Whitaker stepped into the hallway, Frank following behind with a careful dignity. The sudden hush in the lobby was deafening. Phones rose discreetly. A few whispers rippled. The judge addressed Cynthia directly. "Supervisor Barton, thank you for coming so quickly. I want you to be aware of the seriousness of this incident." Olivia opened her mouth to protest, but the judge raised a hand, stopping her cold. "Miss Olivia, I appreciate your commitment to procedure, but your conduct this morning went beyond the bounds of professionalism." His words, measured and calm, carried the weight of a gavel. "You questioned a veteran's dignity. Now your conduct will be questioned." The shock on Olivia's face was almost painful to watch. She tried again to defend herself, her words tumbling out. "Your Honor, there's no formal tracking for these old claims. No digital verification. It's my job to protect the county against fraud. Anyone could forge these papers. Whitaker turned to Cynthia. Supervisor, I recommend that Miss Olivia be suspended pending a full review. We will convene an administrative hearing to determine if her actions were appropriate. Cynthia nodded, the decision already made in her mind. I agree, Judge. Miss Olivia, you are suspended with pay until further notice. Please surrender your badge and credentials to the administrator. Olivia's hands shook as she handed over her ID. Her eyes shone with anger and humiliation. She looked at Frank, who merely watched her with a calm sadness, then at Whitaker and Cynthia. For a moment, the bravado that had filled her voice hours before was gone. She stood, head bowed, and left the lobby, the door clicking shut behind her. Outside, the courthouse steps were alive with the hum of media. Word had spread quickly, first through social media, then the local press. A few ambitious reporters from the county's online news site had already begun piecing together the incident, streaming shaky footage of Frank's confrontation and the judge's dramatic intervention. The hashtags were already trending. #Frank Delaney, #Honor Our Veterans, #Courthouse Shame. A TV news van parked across the street, its satellite dish gleaming. A young reporter with a microphone approached anyone who would talk. One of the guards, nervous and unsure, declined to comment. But others, an older clerk, a custodian, a veteran who'd been there for his own paperwork, offered fragments of the morning's drama, voices rising as details spread. Inside, Cynthia turned to Frank, her manner shifting to one of genuine respect. Mr. Delaney, I'm sorry for what you experienced. I assure you, we will do everything by the book to review your case and ensure you are treated fairly. Frank nodded. Thank you, ma'am. That's all I ever wanted. Just a fair shake. I don't want anyone in trouble on my account. Just wanted someone to listen. The judge put a reassuring hand on Frank's shoulder. It's not about getting anyone in trouble, Mr. Delaney. It's about respect and accountability. No one should be humiliated for their service. As the courthouse bustled with the aftermath, a commotion outside caught everyone's attention. Reporters pressed against the glass doors, flashes popping as they tried to catch a glimpse of Frank. The crowd on the sidewalk swelled, a mix of curiosity seekers, other veterans, and people drawn by the drama. Cynthia addressed the staff, voice clear and commanding. We will be issuing a statement to the press. Judge Whitaker will handle all official communication. No further comments will be made by staff at this time. Understood. A chorus of nods followed. For a moment, there was order again. Frank, feeling the exhaustion of the day settling into his bones, took a seat in a quiet corner, his folder resting on his lap. He could see Olivia through the glass, standing alone on the sidewalk, shoulders slumped, her confidence shattered. He felt no satisfaction at her downfall, only the familiar ache of a world too quick to judge, too slow to remember. For Frank Delaney, it was never about vengeance. It was about dignity. He sat quietly as the world outside raged and gossiped, clutching the same battered folder that had, for a brief, humiliating moment, defined his worth. But this time, as reporters jostled and county officials scrambled, he realized something had shifted. He was no longer invisible. By midday, the courthouse incident had escaped the confines of government bureaucracy and spilled into the restless, digital bloodstream of the modern world. What began as an uncomfortable confrontation in the records office now unfolded on cell phones, laptops, and TV screens across the county and far beyond. A bystander's quick-thinking thumb, swiping record in those tense first moments, had captured every second. Olivia's disbelief, the guard's grip, Frank's stammered protests, and Judge Whitaker's booming intervention. Within hours, the footage was everywhere. Social media platforms lit up, The hashtags #FrankDelaney and #HonorOurVeterans trended locally, then regionally, then, almost overnight, nationally. The video was dissected in slow motion. The smirk on Olivia's face, the defeat in Frank's posture, the judge's indignation. Everyone had an opinion, and no one seemed willing to keep it to themselves. In his small house, Frank sat hunched on his faded couch, the battered folder beside him. The TV, long ignored, was now switched on. News anchors debated the story, replaying the video on a loop. Was this a case of ageism, bureaucratic overreach, or just a misunderstanding blown out of proportion? The questions came from every angle. Frank watched with a strange sense of dislocation, as if he were seeing someone else's life projected on the screen. He scrolled through his phone, which now vibrated with texts and missed calls from numbers he didn't recognize. Some were local veterans, offering words of encouragement or sharing their own stories of neglect. Others were strangers, some supportive, some angry, a few downright hateful. The internet, it seemed, was never one-sided. One comment thread on a local news site burned into Frank's mind. "This old man is probably just trying to get free land. These scams happen all the time." Another responded, "My granddad fought in Korea. These government workers have no respect. That clerk should be fired." Frank's niece, Jenny, who lived 2 towns over, arrived that afternoon, face flushed with anxiety and anger. She waved her phone at him, frustration bubbling over. "Uncle Frank, do you see what they're saying? Some people are calling you a hero. Others are calling you a fraud. It's insane. And that poor clerk, they're tearing her apart too." Frank shook his head, tired. "I don't want anyone hurt on my account, Jenny. I just wanted what was right. I never asked for any of this noise." Jenny sat down, scrolling through hundreds of comments and messages. "You need to know you're not alone in this. Look at all these veterans backing you up. They're saying it happens all the time. Guys getting lost in the system, paperwork vanishing, nobody believing them. You started something, Uncle Frank. I know it's uncomfortable, but maybe it's necessary." The story continued to unravel on talk radio, where callers argued over Olivia's conduct and the county's responsibility. "She was just following protocol," said one. "Protocol isn't an excuse for humiliation," countered another. People dug up old stories, other veterans ignored, old promises broken, bureaucratic hurdles that seemed designed to erase history rather than honor it. A reporter from the local ABC affiliate called for an interview. Frank refused, overwhelmed by the idea of explaining himself yet again. The courthouse, meanwhile, was besieged by journalists and camera crews. Olivia's face, once only familiar to a few dozen residents, now appeared in pixelated screenshots across the internet. Her name tossed about by the mob. Some supported her, insisting she'd just done her job. Others demanded she be fired, or worse. A local veterans group held a rally outside the courthouse, American flags snapping in the summer wind. The group's commander, a broad-shouldered man with a Marine Corps cap and a booming voice, addressed the crowd and the cameras. "Frank's story isn't rare. We've all been ignored. Every vet in this country has a Frank Delaney moment. A time when the country they served told them to wait, to come back later, to prove it again." The crowd murmured in agreement. Some veterans wore their uniforms. Others clutched old photos or dog tags. One woman held up a sign, "Respect all who served." Another read, "Delayed honor is dishonor." Frank watched the coverage from his living room, feeling both pride and embarrassment twist in his gut. He didn't like attention. He'd always kept to himself, taking comfort in the silence of routine. Now, even a walk to the mailbox meant bracing for curious neighbors or well-meaning strangers eager to shake his hand and say, "Thank you for your service." The words sounded different now, both warmer and, in some ways, emptier, like a phrase people were required to say but rarely understood. Meanwhile, the courthouse staff endured their own kind of backlash. Olivia, suspended and under review, had become a symbol, depending on who you asked, either of a broken system or of scapegoating gone too far. Her friends took to social media to defend her. Olivia is not anti-veteran. She just wanted to do her job by the book. Why is everyone so quick to judge? But in the heat of public outrage, nuance rarely survived. Inside the courthouse, Cynthia Barton and Judge Whitaker worked to restore calm. The county released an official statement. "We regret the distress caused to Mr. Delaney and are reviewing procedures to ensure all veterans receive fair, respectful treatment." The press demanded more. A popular podcaster asked for an interview with Frank. Veterans from as far away as Texas sent emails and letters. Some offered legal help, others shared stories of their own battles with indifferent bureaucrats. Frank tried to tune out the noise, but Jenny wouldn't let him hide. "You have a chance to say something for all of them," she urged. "You don't have to go on TV, but maybe write a letter, or just let them know you're not angry. You just want things to be better." That night, as the world outside argued over his worth, Frank found himself drawn to the quiet of his porch. He sat in the darkness, Salty the cat curling around his ankles. He listened to the distant sound of traffic, the cicadas buzzing, the faint cheer from the veterans' rally echoing down the block. For all the noise, there was still peace to be found in simple things. Yet the events of the day had changed him. In the faces of the veterans at the rally, in the supportive messages, Frank saw a community that had long been invisible, now finally beginning to be heard. For every hateful comment, there were 10 voices raised in gratitude or outrage, refusing to let his story disappear beneath the bureaucratic shuffle. For the first time in years, Frank let himself hope that maybe, just maybe, this moment might mean something. Not just for him, but for every old sailor, soldier, and airman waiting for their story to matter. The next morning broke with the same relentless buzz as the night before. Frank awoke to the drone of a lawnmower in the distance, birds bickering on the windowsill, and his phone vibrating with more messages than he could ever hope to answer. He shuffled into the kitchen, poured himself a cup of black coffee, and tried to focus on the familiar clatter of his spoon in the mug. Anything to drown out the storm swirling outside his quiet life. Jenny was already up, her laptop open at the kitchen table, eyes rimmed with fatigue but alight with determination. She'd barely slept, scouring old family boxes and the internet for anything that might help. "Uncle Frank," she said, "you need to see this." She clicked on a video of last night's rally, where veterans told stories of their own bureaucratic nightmares. Some spoke his name with reverence. Others held up handwritten signs. "Believe Frank. Honor our vets. Don't bury history in paperwork." Frank grunted, embarrassed by the attention. "I just wanted to fix my land claim, not start a revolution," he muttered. Jenny smiled. "You may not have wanted it, but you started it anyway." There was a knock at the door. Frank tensed, expecting another reporter, but it was only Mrs. Gutierrez from next door, holding a stack of mail and a foil-wrapped plate of breakfast tamales. "You're famous now, Frank," she laughed. "Eat something before you get too big for your britches." Her warmth was a welcome antidote to the chaos outside. Frank thanked her, his spirits lifting a little. He was just finishing breakfast when Jenny came hurrying in from the garage, her arms full of dusty boxes. "I found something," she said, voice trembling with excitement. She dropped the boxes on the table and began digging through old family documents, birth certificates, faded school report cards, and, at the very bottom, a battered cigar box held shut by two rubber bands. "What's all that?" Frank asked, already bracing himself for a wave of memories. "Letters, Uncle Frank. All addressed to you. Some official, some not." Jenny peeled back the rubber bands and began pulling out envelopes, many yellowed and fragile. Some bore the return address of the Department of the Navy, others the careful handwriting of old friends, and a few were marked "Official Correspondence" in faded block letters. Frank's hands shook as he sifted through the contents. There was a thank you note from the widow of a sailor he'd pulled from the fire, written in elegant cursive. "You gave me the greatest gift, a second chance with my husband. We will never forget you." There were Navy commendations, including one signed by his old captain. Petty Officer Delaney's actions went beyond the call of duty. He risked his own life to save 4 crewmates during the Bluefin explosion of '72. There were photos, too. Grainy images of young men smiling beside their submarine, and a group shot at a medal ceremony, Frank barely recognizable but unmistakable in the front row. Jenny stopped suddenly, her eyes wide. "Look at this," she whispered, pulling out a heavy envelope stamped with the official seal of the Secretary of the Navy. Frank's breath caught. He'd forgotten about that letter, received decades earlier and tucked away, its meaning dulled by the grind of daily life. Hands trembling, he opened the envelope. The letter inside was formal, dated September 1972, and bore the signature of the Secretary himself. "Dear Petty Officer Delaney, the Department of the Navy acknowledges your extraordinary courage during the recent incident aboard the USS Bluefin. Your actions reflect the highest traditions of naval service. The enclosed authorization is provided in recognition of your heroism, entitling you to participate in the Navy Land Recompense Program." Frank's eyes filled with tears. He'd kept that letter, telling himself it didn't matter anymore, that nobody cared. But here, in the middle of his cluttered kitchen, the truth was laid bare. The Navy had remembered, even if the world had forgotten. Jenny snapped photos of the documents, emailing them to a local historian she'd met at the rally. Within an hour, 2 men from the county's historical society arrived, breathless with excitement. They pored over the papers, their reverence for history radiating in every gesture. "This is remarkable, Mr. Delaney," said one. "You have everything: the Navy's acknowledgement, eyewitness statements, even original signatures. There's no question these are authentic." Outside, the media frenzy only grew. TV vans idled at the curb. A reporter from the local NPR station called, voice gentle, asking if Frank would share his story on air. "The community wants to hear from you," she explained. "It's more than just your claim now. It's about all the veterans who fell through the cracks." Frank hesitated. He wasn't one for grand speeches. Still, he knew the moment was bigger than his discomfort. With Jenny's encouragement, he agreed to a brief interview, letting the historian join him for context. They sat together on the porch, microphones clipped to their shirts, as the morning sun painted gold on the cracked concrete. The reporter began, "Mr. Delaney, you've become the face of something much larger than yourself." "How does that feel?" Frank thought carefully. "It's strange. I spent 50 years keeping quiet, figuring my story wasn't worth much. But I guess there's a lot of us out there. Guys who never wanted attention, just a fair shake." The historian interjected, holding up the secretary's letter. "This is proof. Mr. Delaney's record is not just legitimate. It's exemplary. These documents have been validated by multiple sources. There is no question about his service or his right to the land." As the interview aired, public sentiment shifted. The same voices that once doubted now rallied behind Frank. More veterans came forward, sharing their own sealed letters, lost medals, and stories of being dismissed or ignored. The courthouse was flooded with reporters, and the county office scrambled to contain the story. Even Judge Whitaker took to the airwaves, giving a rare public statement. Mr. Delaney's courage and sacrifice are beyond dispute. Our community owes him more than an apology. We owe him our respect and our promise to do better by every veteran who walks through our doors. Inside his home, Frank felt the weight he'd carried for so long begin to lift. For the first time in decades, his story was not met with disbelief or bureaucratic indifference, but with validation, gratitude, and a collective promise that no one's service would be erased by paperwork again. He sat on the porch that evening, watching the sun set through a break in the clouds. Salty curled on his lap, purring softly. Frank stroked the old cat and smiled, feeling, finally, that he was not alone, not just in his struggle, but in his hope for something better. And for the first time in years, Frank allowed himself to believe that the Navy hadn't just remembered him. Now, the whole world did too. The courthouse lawn had never seen a crowd like this. On a warm Saturday afternoon, the small town seemed to pour onto the grass in a sea of folding chairs, camera tripods, and fluttering American flags. Someone had set up a temporary stage near the courthouse steps, decorated with bunting and a banner that read, "Honoring Frank Delaney and all who served." The honor ceremony, announced just 2 days prior, had already drawn news crews from 3 states and countless locals eager to witness the moment justice was done. Not just for Frank, but for every veteran who'd ever felt invisible. Frank Delaney stood in the wings behind the stage, his battered folder finally replaced by a crisp manila envelope, the documents within freshly verified, their edges squared by official seals and historian signatures. He wore his old Navy dress blues, the uniform well cared for but showing its years, a slight fray at the cuffs, medals tarnished but shining with pride. Jenny was at his side, fussing with his tie, tears in her eyes even as she tried to act calm. "Don't forget to breathe, Uncle Frank," she whispered, dabbing at a spot on his collar. "It's your day." Frank managed a thin smile. "Not just mine. A lot of guys never got a day like this." The program began with the county band playing the Star-Spangled Banner, the sound swelling over the crowd. Judge Whitaker took the podium first, his usual stoicism softened by genuine emotion. He told the story of the Bluefin fire, how Frank, then a young petty officer, had saved 4 men from certain death. He read aloud from the secretary of the Navy's letter, his voice catching as he recounted his own family's debt to Frank. "There are debts this country cannot repay with medals or land or ceremonies," Whitaker said, looking directly at Frank. "But we can try to honor the men and women who have given us so much. And we can start today." Next came Supervisor Cynthia Barton, her tone official but her eyes warm. She announced that not only had Frank's land claim been approved, but that the county, in partnership with local veterans groups, was dedicating a new community park in Frank's name. Cheers erupted as she unveiled a sign, "Delaney Veterans Park Honor, Service, Sacrifice." Frank's knees nearly buckled. He looked at Jenny, stunned. "A park, kid. Can you believe that?" She squeezed his hand, grinning through tears. "You earned it, Uncle Frank. And so did everyone you saved." But the most unexpected moment came when Olivia, the suspended clerk, stepped onto the stage, her hands trembling as she approached the microphone. The crowd went silent, some out of curiosity, others out of anger. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "My name is Olivia Parker. Many of you know me as the clerk involved in Mr. Delaney's case." She paused, her voice wavering. "I was wrong. I judged a man by the look of a folder, not the weight of a life." I let rules blind me to respect. I am truly sorry, Mr. Delaney. I'm sorry to every veteran who's ever felt ignored or doubted. I will do better, and I hope this county will too." There was a long, uncertain silence. Then Frank, moved by her courage, stood and nodded in forgiveness. The crowd followed, applause rising and rippling across the lawn. Olivia, tears streaking her cheeks, stepped down, her apology received, her lesson learned. As the ceremony continued, local veterans shared their own stories, some funny, some heartbreaking, all threaded with gratitude. The town's oldest veteran, 93-year-old Carl Jenkins, shuffled up to the microphone and offered Frank a weathered salute. "You did us proud, sailor. Welcome home, finally." The formal presentation of Frank's land deed followed. Cynthia Barton handed him the official documents, embossed and sealed, as a dozen photographers captured the moment. "By the authority of the county and in recognition of your service, Mr. Delaney, we grant you the property promised long ago. May it serve as a symbol of what's possible when a community chooses to remember." It was time for Frank to speak. Jenny steadied him as he approached the podium, the crowd now silent but for the soft rustle of flags. Frank looked out, seeing not just faces, but generations. Kids on their parents' shoulders, aging veterans in faded jackets, families with hands pressed to their hearts. He took a breath, feeling the words he'd practiced so many times settle in his chest. His voice, though rough and low, carried clear. "I didn't keep those men alive to get a thank you. But I appreciate this more than you know. For a long time I thought my story didn't matter, that it would stay in a drawer, forgotten like so many others. But it turns out none of us are really forgotten if someone's willing to listen." He paused, his gaze drifting to Judge Whitaker. "Justice isn't always a courtroom. Sometimes it's just being seen, being believed. That's all I ever wanted." Frank looked at Olivia, nodded, then at the crowd. "We all make mistakes. What matters is how we fix them. I hope today we started to fix something bigger than just my claim." The applause was thunderous. Veterans wept openly, families cheered, and even the reporters found themselves wiping their eyes. Jenny hugged Frank tightly, her voice shaking with pride. As the ceremony wound down, people lingered to shake Frank's hand, share their own stories, or simply say thank you. The band struck up "America the Beautiful," and the park sign gleamed in the late afternoon sun. Olivia approached Frank one last time. "I meant what I said," she whispered. "If you ever need help, anything, I'll be there." Frank smiled, the bitterness of their first meeting softened by forgiveness. "Just treat the next guy with a little patience, Olivia. That's all any of us want." As dusk fell, the crowd dispersed, but the feeling lingered, a sense of something healed, a wrong made right in front of the world. Frank walked through the new park, Jenny by his side. The land now truly his, a gift earned not just for himself, but for every veteran whose story ever risked being lost. And in that gentle twilight, surrounded by neighbors, old friends, and strangers who'd become family, Frank Delaney finally felt at home. As the last echoes of applause faded, and the crowd drifted away from Delaney Veterans Park, the sense of celebration began to dissolve into something softer, quieter, and more difficult to define. For Frank, the whirlwind of the honor ceremony left him feeling both lighter and heavier, a strange contradiction he couldn't quite shake. He had always been a private man, more at home in the gentle rhythm of solitary mornings and small routines than in the glare of public recognition. Now his name was on a park, his story told to thousands, but the old ache of invisibility hadn't fully disappeared. It had only changed its shape. That night, Frank returned to his little house. Jenny insisted on staying over, making tea and heating up leftovers. But eventually she kissed his cheek, and left him to his thoughts. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the gentle purr of Salty curled up on his lap. Outside, the street was unusually quiet, as if the whole town had decided to let Frank rest for once. He sat in his favorite chair, eyes wandering to the Navy memorabilia now lovingly dusted and reorganized. The battered folder had been replaced on the mantel with the formal deed to his new land, flanked by his medals and the letter from the Secretary of the Navy, once tucked away, now displayed for anyone who cared to see. But tonight, it wasn't the awards or the applause that lingered in his mind. It was the moments of silence in between, the faces of men he hadn't seen in decades, and the memories of what service and sacrifice had really meant. Frank thought of the veterans who'd attended the ceremony, the way they watched him, silent and solemn, hands gripping old caps or faded photographs. Some approached to shake his hand, but most simply nodded, a gesture that spoke volumes. For many, words had long since failed. They too knew the price of silence, the kind that comes from being overlooked, misunderstood, or quietly enduring wounds no one could see. In the days that followed, Frank received letters, far more than he could ever answer. Some were from other veterans, sharing stories of being ignored or dismissed. Others were from younger service members, expressing hope that things might be different now. One note from a widow stood out. "My husband kept his service a secret. After seeing your story, my son and I found his medals tucked in a drawer. We're proud to remember him out loud now. Thank you for your courage." He read each letter slowly, tears often blurring the words. He realized that the ceremony hadn't just changed his life. It had touched something deep and unspoken in others. By refusing to stay silent, even when it was easier, Frank had broken the quiet spell that kept so many stories buried. Yet the aftermath was bittersweet. For every message of support, there were reminders of what silence had cost. Lost time, unspoken grief, the missed chance to say, "I see you," before it was too late. Late one evening, Frank wandered into the new park bearing his name. It was empty, the lamplight painting soft shadows across the grass. He walked the path that circled the playground and the small memorial stone already installed near the flagpole. On the stone, an inscription read, "To all who served and waited to be heard, your silence has weight. Your story has worth." Frank sat on a bench, the night air cool on his skin. He thought of all the years he'd spent believing that his sacrifice, and those of his crewmates, were meant to be forgotten, lost in the machinery of paperwork and time. The world had thanked him once, decades ago, then moved on. It was easy to believe that's all he deserved. But now, in the quiet of the park, Frank felt the presence of those who'd come before him, and those who would come after. He realized that the price of silence wasn't just personal, it was collective. Every veteran who stayed quiet out of pride, humility, or fear of not being believed added another stone to the pile. The ceremony, the park, the letters, these were ways of lifting some of that weight, sharing the burden so it didn't crush the next man or woman who walked into a courthouse with nothing but a folder and a memory. Back at his house, Frank performed his nightly ritual, feeding Salty, setting out a dish of milk, and checking the locks on the doors. Tonight, though, there was one more step. He took the old photo of the USS Bluefin crew and placed it on the kitchen table, sitting across from it with a mug of coffee. He spoke softly, as if the men in the picture could hear him across the years. "We did our best, boys. It finally counted for something." Meanwhile, in living rooms and VFW halls across the county, veterans gathered to watch replays of the ceremony. Some watched in silence, others with tears or laughter, but all felt the impact of a story like Frank's breaking through the static of everyday life. Even Judge Whitaker, after a long day at court, returned home and found himself staring at an old photo of his father. He smiled, clipped the article about Frank to the frame, and whispered, "He never forgot you." The next morning, Frank woke to find an envelope on his porch. Inside was a faded photograph, a much younger Judge Whitaker, standing proudly beside his father, both in navy dress whites. On the back was a handwritten note, "He never forgot you. Neither will I." Frank stood on the porch for a long time, the morning sun warm on his face, the noise of the world momentarily held at bay. He realized, finally, that the point wasn't whether he'd been thanked or remembered, but that he and countless others had mattered. The silence had been broken. The price had been paid, not just by him, but by all who'd waited for someone to listen. That evening, as dusk settled over the town, Frank sat alone, saluting the empty chair across from him. He didn't need an audience. The world outside had changed, but the quiet honor inside him was the same. He knew now that being heard was enough. Sometimes, that was all that mattered. There's a silence at the end of a long journey that's different from any other. The kind that settles not because everything has been said, but because something important has finally been heard. For Frank Delaney, that silence came on a late summer night. His old house washed in the gold of streetlights, a gentle breeze rattling the metals on the mantel. The last guests from the ceremony had gone. The news trucks packed up. The world moved on, but something essential lingered in the air. The sense that for once, a story that could have ended in a folder had found its way into people's hearts. He stood in his living room, the weight of decades, of service, disappointment, hope, sitting easy on his shoulders at last. The battered folder, once the sum of his worth in the eyes of strangers, now rested beneath a frame on the wall, surrounded by pictures and handwritten notes from neighbors, veterans, and even children who'd heard his story in class. That night, Frank let his mind wander. He remembered the feel of cold steel beneath his fingers on the bluefin, the acrid taste of smoke, the sound of distant voices calling for help. He remembered the promise he made to himself that day. Don't let anyone go unseen. The world had measured him by the pages he'd carried, the protocols he'd faced. But Frank knew better now. True worth could never be captured in a file or a form, and dignity wasn't granted by a signature or a stamp. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Frank opened the door to find a group of local kids from the high school ROTC, clutching a hand-painted banner. "Thank you, Mr. Delaney. Our stories matter because yours does." They stood awkwardly on the porch, unsure if they'd done enough, but Frank beamed at them. Come in," he said, waving them toward the kitchen for lemonade and a few words of hard-won wisdom. The evening became a tapestry of quiet conversation, stories swapped, lessons offered, laughter mingling with memory. The kids asked him what it felt like to be famous. Frank shook his head. Famous fades, service sticks. You might get a medal or a parade, but what matters is what you do for the people next to you, every day. After they left, Frank returned to his chair, salty, purring at his feet. The house felt full, even in its emptiness. He gazed at the folder again, and thought about all the lives lived between the lines of official forms, the stories that never made it into speeches or ceremonies, but mattered just as much. The world had almost missed his story because it was too easy to forget that greatness often wears old shoes, walks with a limp, or stands patiently in line, holding a crumpled folder. As the days passed, Frank's story rippled outward. Veterans from across the country wrote in to thank him, not just for his service, but for proving that their service still mattered. People who'd never worn a uniform found themselves thinking twice about the elders in their communities, wondering what invisible histories might be hidden in plain sight. The courthouse staff underwent new training, learning to listen first, to check their judgments at the door. Olivia returned to her desk with a new humility, often pausing to ask, "Is there anything else you'd like to share about your story?" One Saturday morning, a busload of elementary school children arrived at Delaney Veterans Park for a field trip. Their teacher knelt beside the memorial stone, reading the inscription aloud. "To all who served and waited to be heard, your silence has weight. Your story has worth." The children listened, their eyes wide, before a little boy asked, "Will someone remember us too?" The teacher smiled, looking up at Frank, who happened to be tending the roses by the walkway. "That depends," she replied. "Will you remember the people who came before you?" Frank's days settled into a new rhythm, answering letters, greeting visitors, and caring for the land that was now his by right. He often walked the park in the evenings, watching families gather, children play, veterans sit together in quiet conversation. Every now and then, someone would approach, hesitant but grateful, to shake his hand or simply say, "Thank you for not giving up." Yet for all the change, Frank remained who he'd always been, a man who believed that real heroism was measured in moments of decency, in silent promises kept, in the simple courage to stand and be counted. He knew now that his story had become more than a folder on a desk. It was a lesson echoing in every corner of the community. Sometimes at sunset, he'd pause by the memorial stone, letting the words settle around him like an old, familiar song. He thought of the men he'd carried through smoke and fire, of Judge Whitaker's gratitude, of Olivia's apology, and the many silent nods of those who finally saw him. Not as a number, not as a problem to solve, but as a man who mattered. Voiceover, as if echoing from the depths of memory, he carried lives through smoke and fire, but was nearly erased by a policy form. In a country that thanks you once and forgets you forever, we need to remember, some men served once and have been waiting decades for that service to mean something. A pause. Don't wait for a uniform to show respect, and don't let age fool you. Greatness might be holding a crumpled folder at your local desk. Every story matters, if someone is willing to listen. And finally, Frank's voice, steady and sure, as if speaking not just for himself, but for everyone who'd ever waited too long to be seen. Don't bury these stories in paperwork. Ask, listen, remember. The measure of a life isn't in what you can fit inside a folder. It's in the lives you touch along the way. The screen fades to black, the words lingering in the mind. Like, share, and subscribe, because stories like Frank's shouldn't be buried beneath paperwork.